"2021 was weird. In many ways, it felt like an extension of 2020. The pandemic year unfortunately became the pandemic era. For games, that mostly meant continued delays. The new console cycle is moving in slow motion thanks to global supply chain disruption. So it was a slightly more muted year than we'd originally thought. But I think that portends a really strong 2022. Here's hoping, at least. Regardless, there were many triumphs in 2021. Just shipping a game at all is a triumph at the best of times. There were many games I liked this year. Some I loved, and a few I wish I could have loved. Let's talk about those first. There's been a void in the horror game market since the disappearance of Silent Hill. The medium tries very, very hard to fill that void. Silent Hill influences can be felt in its fixed camera angles, dual worlds concept, the soundtrack from Silent Hill composer Akira Yamaoka, and the general emphasis on exploring the dark psyches of its characters. The medium's defining feature is split-screen segments where you inhabit both the real and spiritual worlds at once. It's a neat trick, even if it doesn't really enhance the gameplay all that much. The creepy, surreal look of the game's horror elements was inspired by a Polish artist whose name I would utterly butcher if I tried to pronounce it, but there it is if you want to try. The general Polishness of the game gives it a distinct feel that permeates the locations, narrative, and nature of the horror. In that way, the game does feel fresh and distinct from Silent Hill's American setting as seen through a Japanese lens. This game goes to some genuinely dark and uncomfortable places. In my view, the darker the content of the story, the better it needs to be in order to justify including those elements. It's easy to include a bunch of dark and disturbing content. It's much harder to do that in a way that's ultimately redemptive, insightful, or empathetic. I don't think the medium is gratuitous, but I also found the story in Central Mystery unsatisfying. It just kind of ends, but the ending is harmed rather than enhanced by its ambiguity. Bloober Team has been accused of ripping off many of their ideas and concepts. The line between inspiration, homage, and outright creative theft is a blurry one. Whatever else you might say about this studio, there's clearly a lot of talent on display here in realizing what they have. They could yet create a horror masterpiece, but the medium's not it. I've been looking forward to a new console-based Mario Golf for a long time. The series skipped the Wii, which was probably merciful since that would have been a motion-controlled nightmare. But then it skipped the Wii U as well. Years into the Switch's run, we finally got a new Mario Golf. And it was not worth the wait. Super Rush is not a bad game, but it does exemplify the lazy soullessness of Nintendo's lesser games. There's a special kind of Nintendo polish and charm that's just not present here. I can't escape the feeling at every turn that it could have, should have, been just a little bit better than it is. At launch, the content was pretty thin, and while updates fleshed out the roster and course selection, some things from past games were still missing. What happened to the great extra modes like club slots or ring attack? Did they need to be sacrificed for the new special game types like Battle Golf and Speed Golf? Frenetic action isn't what I'm looking for out of golf. I think the most condemning thing I can say about this game is that I would have rather had an HD remake of Mario Golf Toadstool Tour from the GameCube. Super Rush fails to improve on the basic formula and course design of a game from 2003. In fact, the basic controls and tools are worse. This is a core flaw of the game. They abandoned what worked so well in the past and replaced it with something different, but inferior. That's not entirely surprising when you look at the inconsistent track record of Mario's sports games, but it's still disappointing. "12 Minutes combines two potentially frustrating things: adventure games and time loops. It's a daring move. The advantages of both are obvious, so are the pitfalls. The classic problem with adventure games is obtuse puzzle design. If you're not thinking about the puzzle in the same way as the designer, it can quickly devolve into frustration or pure trial and error, which is never good. Likewise, once you stop learning new information to apply in the next time loop, that structure becomes tedious instead of exciting. What should be a vast possibility space becomes a restrictive box, and I'm sorry to say both issues were present in 12 minutes. I had some stretches of real engagement with the game. We were clicking at first, and it was great. But the frustration wasn't far behind. In time loop movies and TV, the power of editing keeps tedium at bay. 12 minutes doesn't have this advantage, and there's a whole lot of rote repetition as a result. You can fast forward some things, but it's not enough. It's easy to mess up a sequence of events and have to start all over. That only compounds the frustration. The last time loop game I played before this was Outer Wilds. That was my 2019 Game of the Year. I had some of the same frustrations there, but the game was much larger. I could easily shift my attention to a different problem instead of banging my head on the same one over and over. Far more importantly, Outer Wilds felt exceedingly fresh and profound in its presentation and themes in a way that 12 minutes, even with its A-list Hollywood voice talent, absolutely does not. It was worth the frustration to finish Outer Wilds. I didn't finish 12 minutes, but I've seen the opinions of people who did, and I'm glad I stopped. I missed nothing. Like most games that end up here, Deathloop is not awful. It's competent, often fun, and well made. My disappointment comes from the gigantic waste of potential, the failure to make good on its amazing premise and to creatively reconstitute ideas from its influences into something unique and harmonious. For some, Deathloop did exactly that. I can see glimpses of an amazing game that could have been, but I can't escape the conclusion that it's actually fairly shallow. Deathloop is another time loop game, and it suffers from some of the same problems as other games in that mold. You're tasked with assassinating 8 targets in the same day in order to break out of the loop. Essentially, it's a roguelite with mechanics adapted from Arcane Studios' previous games like Dishonored and Prey, a shooter with a fun set of superpowers and level design that's meant to reward exploration. Despite being more fun by virtue of its action focus, this game doesn't escape the tedium and stagnation of the time loop construction. Unlike 12 minutes, which is obtuse and easy to make mistakes in, Deathloop spells everything out. It spills the jigsaw pieces on the floor, then brushes the player aside to begin assembling it without you. You're here to shoot things, player. Leave the real thinking for the developers. You choose your general approach, find different ways through the environment, and decide whether to be stealthy or go loud. But those choices feel hollow without long-term consequence or strong narrative context for your actions. The shooting and movement are better than any previous game from this studio, but the action is stretched thin with little variation to enemies and encounters, and few creative flourishes in the level design compared with the company's previous work. Overly generous healing item distribution and extra lives dispel much of the tension of a roguelike, and make the game too easy overall. The story, like the rest of the game, could have gone in some interesting directions. Instead, it feels nascent, unfinished. What we do get is often bafflingly bad, despite charismatic, likable performances from the principal cast. Arcane Studios is responsible for some of my favorite games in recent memory. I thought they were going to bring their strengths of level design, player choice, and deep gameplay to bear on this new structural conceit. But this is a shallow action game masquerading as an immersive sim. It's an immersive sim where the immersion doesn't matter. Resources don't matter, choice doesn't matter, because you'll just do it all again and again and again. The game has little to nothing of substance to say about that cycle. I thought Deathloop was going to be Dishonored meets Hitman, 2 games I really love. I thought it was going to be an expansion of the ideas in Prey Mooncrash, Arcane's next most recent game that pioneered mixing immersive sim mechanics with a roguelike structure. That game would have easily been my Game of the Year. Instead, Deathloop is here, on this list. Since I began these year-end videos, this is the most disappointed I've ever been in a game. I finally got around to playing Disco Elysium this year. I'm glad I waited for the fully voiced Final Cut version of the game, because I probably would have fallen off of it if I'd had to read everything. There is a lot of text in this game, like several novels worth. I prefer not to do quite so much reading when I'm playing a video game. That's just not what I come to the medium for. Disco Elysium might be verbose, but it's mostly worth it for the vivid world it paints with its words, and the huge amount of role-playing a primarily text-based approach allows. There are plenty of choices to make as you encounter these walls of words. I admire the audacity of an RPG that almost never resorts to action or violence. Most of the action happened before the beginning of the game, and yet you're presented with consistently engaging choices that draw you in. Elysium is a strange world, populated by very recognizably human characters, with all of the sociological and psychological complexity and messiness that games often oversimplify or ignore altogether. The game strikes an odd, offbeat tone. It's idiosyncratic, with a distinctive ethereal voice, while also running the gamut of human emotions, thoughts, and topics. It's serious, while never taking itself too seriously. It's funny, but almost always in a way that hints at an underlying sadness. The writing is the biggest strength of the game, but it's also the primary mode of engagement. I found that to be a little fatiguing after a while, as I went from one lengthy, dense conversation to the next, wishing for some kind of break in between. But the game only offers more text. I wish more of the game had been presented through visuals, events, and gameplay systems, rather than just text, or, in this case, excellent voice acting. I hope the success of this game means that future titles will be able to branch out mechanically with more excellent gameplay systems to complement the writing and world building. I spent a long time in my review of Psychonauts 2 trying to figure out why I didn't like it as much as I should have. The platforming is good, the story is good, the writing is good. It's fun, creative, and full of energy. The 2005 original is a cult classic platformer, bursting with personality, originality, heart, and humor. It's also a little janky in the gameplay department. Although the sequel is not quite as fresh by definition, the gameplay is built on a much more solid foundation, and the game is a more even experience throughout. I'd recommend Psychonauts 2 to just about anyone. At least give it a shot. There's so much to like. It's approachable without being overly simplistic. That goes for the narrative and the gameplay. I have few objective complaints. Most are little quality of life issues, and some of them might have even been addressed by post-release patches. Just look at all the color and style and creativity on display here. There are moments in Psychonauts 2 that rank among the best of the year in gaming, and some of the most creatively inventive I've ever seen in a platformer. While the main story takes a more serious turn later on, there are many moments of wonderful comedy. Most of the other games I'm highlighting in this video aren't appropriate for kids, but it's nice to see one that can be appealing to kids and adults, that has something to say to each group, and balances dark subject matter with a family-friendly presentation. That's the kind of balance that made Pixar the premier name in Western animated film. As much attention as Ratchet and Clank got for looking like a real-time animated movie, Psychonauts 2 also includes quality storytelling and characters, mixing heart, humor, and artistic mastery to create something truly special. The reason this game is an honorable mention instead of a best game is because something about it didn't totally click with me, especially the back half of the game. I can't point to any objective critique though. It's not the game, it's me. I still think Psychonauts 2 is one of the best games of the year. It's just not one of mine. I have such mixed feelings about Metroid Dread. Finding out it existed at all was one of the year's best surprises, but the game itself did almost as much to push me away as welcome me back. At times I was put off, and other moments made me think it belonged among my best games of the year. Ultimately, it lands in the middle. Metroid Dread is a good game, often a great game, that's held back by a couple of unforced errors and an obstinate attitude toward difficulty. What Metroid Dread gets absolutely right is all the traditional elements. From the very beginning, Samus is a joy to control, and it only gets better as you go through the classic process of acquiring new abilities and equipment. The maps are large, detailed, and fun to explore and revisit. Dread splits the difference between a linear approach to progression and a more open-ended one. Players can sequence break if they want, but for the rest of us, the intended path is better outlined than in past games. The much improved map helps cut down on aimless wandering and backtracking, and is a great asset when hunting for extra collectibles. The tight, responsive controls allow for incredible, intense boss fights. They can be frustratingly difficult compared to the rest of the experience, but they're almost never unfair. Beating them is appropriately satisfying. Mercury, Steam, and Nintendo put a greater focus on action in this game. Too great a focus, I think. While the action is good, there were times in this game when it seemed like I was going from one difficult boss fight to the next, with hardly any break in between. That's not what I come to this series for. The Immies, killer robots meant to inspire the titular feeling of dread, are not scary. If they were meant to inspire fear, then the developers needed to take a page from the survival horror handbook. Dying in video games isn't as scary as almost dying. It's the fear of death, the fear of consequence, that serves to build an atmosphere of terror. You will get killed by the Immies over and over in Metroid Dread, and that's not scary, it's just frustrating. Unfortunately, this is too big a part of the game to ignore when evaluating the whole. That's a real shame, because aside from that, Dread is one of the better designed Metroid games in terms of overall progression. I loved the moment-to-moment combat and exploration in this game, but the frequent difficulty spikes almost ruined the experience for me. The game obstinately refuses to smooth these over, either by offering more optional health collectibles or variable difficulty options. I feel the Immies are a miscalculation, an experiment that just didn't work out. Unfortunately, they'll probably keep me from revisiting this game as much as I'd like, so I guess the killer robots did inspire dread in me, but probably not in the way the developers intended. Forza Horizon 5 is Forza Horizon 4, but in Mexico. That's the reductive, dismissive, easy critique of this open-world driving game, and it's not untrue. When I started playing, I wasn't blown away. It was very much what I remembered from the previous game, but I was compelled enough to keep playing bit by bit. It grew on me gradually until I realized that, yes, the game is familiar, but that doesn't really matter to the bottom line question of whether I'm able to have a good time with it. I am. The game is packed with content. There are literally hundreds of cars. There are events of all stripes punctuated by bigger, flashier showcases and story-driven activities. Mexico has a more diverse set of biomes than the UK setting of the previous game. There are jungles, sand dunes, and a volcano, tropical beaches, quaint little towns, and Mayan ruins. And it all looks terrific through a variety of weather conditions and times of day. Forza Horizon is welcoming to a huge variety of players, whether you're a car enthusiast or just looking for a pretty environment in which to drive around and unwind. I admire that flexibility. More games should give players the power to tailor their experiences on a granular level. For me, this is a great podcast game, a great chill out and relax sort of game. I imagine it's also a good racing game for those who want to tune the difficulty settings toward a more simulationist experience. Forza Horizon 5 maintains the high bar of quality set by the previous game. If Forza Horizon 6 is just the same thing with a new map in a couple of years, I think I'll be okay with that too. Last year, Microsoft brought back Flight Simulator to much acclaim, and this year, they resurrected real-time strategy giant Age of Empires. It's great to have both of these PC gaming franchises return in a modernized form. Compared to the new Flight Simulator, Age of Empires 4 is less impressive at a glance. It looks nice, but it's nowhere close to the leap in visual fidelity as Flight Sim. Rather than pushing toward clearly uncharted territory, it's basically a remake of Age 2's medieval period. I think it's fair to say this game plays it a little safe, but after having played it, I'm okay with that. Given the current market for real-time strategy and the gap between this and the last Age of Empires, it's completely understandable that they would want to emulate the most popular game in the series. The RTS, once a favorite genre of mine, has fallen out of the mainstream in favor of genres that can better fit into the live service model. The good news is that the essential formula, the things that have always made Age of Empires great, are still here, and they're pretty well implemented. There are a bunch of smart, subtle differences that make this game worth playing over the recent remasters of the first three games. Being a new game built from the ground up, it's got a lot of improvements to controls and quality of life that aren't appreciated until you go back to those older games. This is Age of Empires as you remember it, but not quite as it actually was. To my surprise, the thing that drew me into this game and held my interest the most, that got me to learn new skills and strategies, was the campaign mode. In the past, I've dabbled with campaigns as slightly entertaining novelties, but nothing I really wanted to sink my teeth into. Of the 4 campaigns in the game, I completed 3 of them, and there was a substantial amount of content there. Not every mission is a winner, but the majority of them presented exciting and novel challenges that actually did make me better at the game, instead of just teaching me how to beat the specific scenario. Perhaps the best surprise about the whole game is the presentation of the campaigns. Instead of relying on animated cutscenes to give missions context, the game uses maps, graphics, and video of the real places, tools, and techniques from the history it draws upon. You'll see drone shots of modern-day Europe superimposed with wireframe armies where they would have fought centuries ago. It's a fascinating approach to making history more real by connecting it directly to the present. Beating missions unlocks bonus videos on topics ranging from medieval weapons and armor, to the construction of fortifications, to the food and drink of the peasantry. It's a tremendously engaging way of injecting some real history into the game. I watched everyone I could and drank up the historical curiosities presented. I would love to see this approach in more historically based games. Age of Empires 4 is a successful revitalization of the classic franchise. It might not have made as big a splash as the new flight simulator, but it's no less welcome. Kid Amnesia Exhibition is, by its own admission, not a game. I think it's best described as an interactive art piece in celebration of 2 Radiohead albums known for their experimental sound. This interactive exhibit is an experiment befitting the band and their music. It's weird, sometimes unnerving, and also frequently beautiful in a totally unexpected way. Admittedly, I'm a huge fan of the band, so I was going to check this out no matter what. But the thing is free, and I'd say it's got some stuff worth seeing and hearing for that price, even if you're not a fan of the band. I had moments with this game that were among some of the most amazing I had all year with any game or game-like software. Of course, the soundscape is mostly composed of samples from the band's original recordings, arranged in a way that befits the interactive nature. Full songs rarely appear, but when they do, they're accompanied by incredible visualizations. The visuals are actually what surprised me the most. The exhibition contained some of the most mesmerizing, disorienting sights I've ever seen in an interactive piece or video game. Unbound by the requirements of game design or narrative coherence, this is able to run wild with all the possibilities that 3D interactive environments can offer, and the result is something really special, and one of the best looking games or game-adjacent things of the year. Over the years, Resident Evil has occupied many positions along the survival horror, action horror continuum. Village skews farther towards action than any recent title besides last year's Resident Evil 3 remake, but it does action far better than that game without forsaking survival horror completely. It's just not very interested in the slow, claustrophobic dread of Resident Evil 7's best moments. Village trades the creepy haunted house for a grotesque funhouse, and that's totally okay by me. I had a great time with this game, and that's all I wanted from it. I wasn't particular about how that great time was achieved. Above all, Village is really having fun. It's grabbing stuff from all over the Halloween store. That keeps things fresh, entertaining, novel. There's a lot of variety to the feel and methods of the horror. Some segments emphasize combat, some drop it almost entirely, and others are more classically Resident Evil with a mixture of puzzle solving, exploration, and scares. The continual shifts in mode keep you on your toes, which helps with the tension and makes for an entertaining ride. You're never quite sure what to expect next, and that's a fun feeling I don't often get from games of this scale and budget. Apart from a few highly effective horror segments, I don't think Village is particularly scary, but it is consistently tense, which keeps it from being a standard action game. You still have to think about how you're using your resources, even if you're not as ammo-starved as in the other games. More than anything, Village is immaculately paced. None of its segments last too long, and each is distinct. You'll be rewarded for taking things a bit more slowly, for preserving ammo and resources, and exploring for secrets and extras. There's a currency and upgrade system akin to Resident Evil 4 that makes every combat encounter potentially rewarding. Instead of always being a drain on your resources, you can break even or even come out ahead with careful and clever play. I really enjoy where Resident Evil has landed with storytelling in recent years. The narrative is completely ridiculous as always, but there's just a hint of playful self-awareness. As indefensibly goofy as the Resident Evil timeline is, I do admire that Capcom hasn't just hard rebooted the thing. Warts and all, it persists as grotesque, ridiculous, and mutated as the monsters you fight. Playing Resident Evil Village is like jumping between the pool and the hot tub as it shifts between moments of tense horror and over-the-top straight-faced comedy that may or may not be intentional. I can understand why that's not for everyone, but it sure does make you feel alive. Every Hitman game since 2016 has made my best games list. Yes, I do really like the Hitman formula, but they've also been great games that have made the most of that formula. Hitman 3 lives up to its predecessors. That alone is high praise. There's something particularly satisfying about having these three games all turn out so well. They're not perfect, and certainly Hitman 3 could be critiqued for being a little lighter on content and a little less open-ended in some ways than the previous two. But I think the trade-offs made to amplify story moments and add some spice to the World of Assassination trilogy were worth it in the end. Hitman has never been a series I came to for the story. Their gameplay first and foremost, but this one successfully integrates more and better moments of storytelling directly into the missions. The stakes feel higher than I could have imagined for a game based on repeatable sandbox levels with open-ended gameplay and a wry sense of humor about itself. Many of the levels are instant classics: the fictionalized Burj Khalifa in Dubai, the murder mystery mansion in England, the gorgeous sun-bathed winery in Argentina, and the inventive Berlin nightclub, which pits you against enemy agents aware of your presence, increasing the danger and possibility space of the mission like no other in the series. My main critique of this game would be its post-release support, which has been weak compared to past games, but that can't be held against the shipping product itself, which is excellent. And recently, IO Interactive announced there would be new maps, modes, and other content for Year 2 of the game, so this isn't going to be a valid critique for much longer. Modern Hitman is sublime video gaming, equal parts beautiful and ridiculous, smart and stupid. Hitman 3 delivers another set of gorgeous sandboxes, full of inventive ways to lure your targets in for the kill. It joins the previous two games to form one giant game in 3 volumes. To say that Hitman 3 offers more of the same is not a slight, but a compliment of the highest order. Halo was a pretty good shooter. Everyone else has known that for 20 years. I've just never agreed. It always felt stiff, slow, and boring to me. The level design, especially in the original, has aged poorly. I've tried to play almost all the previous games in the series, and I've never been able to connect with one until now. So what's different about Halo Infinite? In some ways, not very much. The enemies, weapons, vehicles, and visuals are all echoes of what's come before. In fact, Infinite could be fairly critiqued for not adding enough new things to the franchise. If I were a veteran of the past games, I might be a lot less impressed, but this is basically my first Halo game, the first time the magic of Halo's combat has clicked for me. Instead of a derivative experience, it's almost entirely new to me. On a fundamental level, the feel and movement are far superior to past games. From the weapons handling to the satisfying sound design, everything about the basics works incredibly well. The structure combines traditional linear levels with an open world that integrates some of the chaotic sandbox fun of the multiplayer into the campaign. That open world isn't very large by the standards of modern big-budget games, The campaign is roughly 15 hours long, including a bunch of side activities, in contrast to the typical open world standard of 100+ hours. But I think that actually works in the game's favor. If you think of Zeta Halo as a really big level that you revisit, instead of an open world, it kind of makes more sense. The open world is a canvas on which the game can paint its unique combination of ground and vehicular combat. But the biggest single element that pushes Halo Infinite this high on my list is the grappling hook. It's one of the most fun tools in a first-person shooter ever. With such a short cooldown, you're encouraged to use it often. It becomes fundamental to your movement in and out of combat, serving both purposes equally well. Combining it with Master Chief's traditionally powerful melee attack never gets old. It's one of those mechanics that makes everything else better. Of course, there's also Halo Infinite's multiplayer.
It's close to total control. New zones. Zones are ready for capture.
I'm terrible at it, but it seems cool if you aren't. When you look at Halo Infinite's component parts, none of them are especially fresh. None of them are entirely new. What's novel is the mixture of elements. Just because other shooter franchises have exhausted the open world concept doesn't mean Halo can't use the format to revitalize itself. That's exactly what it's done with Infinite. After a rocky time stewarding the series and a fraught development cycle on this game, 343 Industries seems to have done it. They made a Halo game worthy of the mantle in the eyes of longtime fans. They also made the first Halo game I've ever liked, and I like it quite a bit. By my own semi-arbitrary rules, Half-Life Alyx can't be my game of the year because it was released in 2020. I didn't get to play it until this year, and plenty of players were in that same boat because it's VR only. I was a big fan of the Half-Life games before Valve abandoned the series, but getting a VR headset to play a new Half-Life game still took some convincing. Would it have been my game of the year had I played it last year? There's a good chance. Alyx is the best VR game I've yet played, but that's not really saying much. Here's a statement that means a lot more. Half-Life Alyx is able to stand shoulder to shoulder with the venerated mainline entries in the series, despite ostensibly being a prequel side story. It isn't. It's actually quite important to the future of the franchise, and I hope it's a bright signal of that future creatively. It's not just the shift to VR that's so amazing. This is the first Half-Life game in well over a decade. Details that were once obscured as blurry textures are now fully realized and interactive. It's a gorgeous game to look at, to be in, even though the environments are mostly worn down. Art design continues to be one of the chief strengths of the franchise, and this is the best it's ever been. Although Alyx mimics many of the familiar Half-Life rhythms, it wisely pared down the action to a more manageable level. Traditional enemy behavior and numbers would be overwhelming in VR. Instead, the game is often tuned as a survival horror experience, with limited ammo and resources that make every shot mean more. Scrounging around the environment for extra ammo and health is not only engaging because of the tactile, responsive nature, it's also necessary from a gameplay standpoint. In the past, simply hitting the R key reloaded your weapons in a perfect, reliable, quick manner. Now that task is up to you. Under pressure in a firefight, or with life-sized zombies shambling toward you, it's not as easy to keep your composure. The same can be said of throwing grenades or using health items. These activities now rely on your motor skills. So you may be doing a lot of the same old things from moment to moment, but VR fundamentally alters your relationship to the game's world and mechanics. That would be novel by itself, but Valve also brought their iterative level design philosophy to bear, resulting in some absolutely inspired scenarios. There's something incredibly special about seeing and doing familiar things, but in a completely different mode that breathes new life into every corner of the world and every dusty old game mechanic. Just as impressively, the world building and character writing also manages to reinvigorate the Half-Life story in a way that makes me excited about the future of the franchise again. I hope there's not another 13-year gap between Half-Life games, but if so, this was great while it lasted. The Forgotten City was originally conceived as a Skyrim mod. As such, it feels like the best parts of older Bethesda games, the most compelling towns and questlines of Elder Scrolls or Fallout before that series became primarily about action and loot. The Forgotten City eschews the RPG elements of those games and narrows the scope in order to focus on a central story and cast of characters. You play a present-day person flung back in time 2,000 years to a small subterranean Roman village. Right away, there's an incredible atmosphere of mystery and wonder. Like Outer Wilds from a couple years ago, much of the Forgotten City's appeal comes from learning what the game is and unraveling its many mysteries. It's difficult to talk about without spoiling, so I'm going to do my best to convey why it's one of the best games I played this year without showing or telling too much. The game was made by a small team, and that does show, but it hardly detracts from the most important elements. It may not be technologically cutting edge, but that doesn't keep its visuals and mechanics from being inventive and effective. The Forgotten City is about story, character, place, and history, with well-considered discussions of philosophy, religion, and morality. You roll into a new place, meet the inhabitants, and start getting to the bottom of what's going on. There's not one central mystery, but several large ones, and a bunch of smaller interpersonal problems to solve. This is actually another time loop game. I submit it as evidence that I don't hate time loops. The Forgotten City sidesteps the issues I had in other games. It gives you plenty of time to explore in each loop, with lots of ways to constantly progress. I never hit that point of tedium. Each time through was productive and exciting. I was constantly learning new things, and the mysteries, even the ones I'd been able to guess, were satisfying. The game has multiple endings based on your route through, but even those manage to avoid tedious repetition. Each shows you something new, revels in a different concept that contributes to your knowledge of the whole. The Forgotten City is less obtuse than something like Outer Wilds that expects the player to do a lot of work finding and putting together the puzzle pieces. It avoids the tedious repetition of 12 minutes by giving the player ways to shortcut or entirely bypass repeated tasks. And unlike Deathloop, the Forgotten City effectively maintains the illusion that you're figuring something out when you're really only following cleverly disguised breadcrumbs. I enjoyed basically every minute of my time with this game, and it's the only game this year I can say that about.